I know these two words that are up on the screen just make all of you immensely happy when you read them. I picked two of your favorite things this week to talk about: taxes and resurrection. What could you love more than taxes and resurrection? Even those two words next to each other just seem wrong, don't they? Taxes and resurrection. Yet that's what we get in the portion of Mark 12 that we read this morning. It's everyone's favorite time of year right now. It's tax season, right? This is the time when everybody gets so happy and joyful because you get to pay taxes and make sure that the roads are maintained even though they never seem to be. Make sure that the infrastructure gets kept up, those sorts of things, right? Everybody's really happy about taxes. Nope. Okay. Just me. I'm the only one that's excited about paying taxes. Well, shame on you all. No, obviously this is a time of great anxiety for a lot of people, right? I mean, already we are in an anxious time because of the virus that's going around right now. But taxes piled on top of that, that's like the worst, of worst sandwiches you could ever possibly think of. That's like eating bologna. Those of you who like bologna, I'm sorry. Tax season. I mean, just bringing up this topic makes some of you squirm and twitch and think, oh, why do we have to talk about taxes? Well, because Jesus talked about it. That's what we're going to look at today. Why does Jesus talk about taxes? What does he have to say about paying taxes? Is there something we can take away from that? And resurrection. Obviously, that's what we're building toward with the life of Jesus. Right? Not only do we have this kind of down topic of taxes, we get to see Jesus begin to talk about resurrection and what that might look like. So let's read about it from Mark's Gospel in chapter 12, and then let's talk about it. Beginning in verse 13, the word of the Lord from the Gospel of Mark. Later, the leaders sent some Pharisees and supporters of Herod to trap Jesus into saying something for which he could be arrested. Teacher, they said, we know how honest you are. You are impartial and don't play favorites. You teach the way of God truthfully. Now tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or shouldn't we? Jesus saw through their hypocrisy and said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a Roman coin, and I'll tell you. When they handed it to him, he asked, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, Jesus said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. His reply completely amazed them. Then Jesus was approached by some Sadducees, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. They posed this question, Teacher, Moses gave us a law that if a man dies, leaving a wife without children, his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry on his brother's name. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers, Jesus, the very sneering sort of voice I imagine them having. The oldest one married and then died without children. So the second brother married the widow, but he also died without children. And then the third brother married her. This continued with all 7 of them, and still there were no children. Last of all, the woman also died. So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her. Jesus replied, your mistake is that you don't know the Scriptures, and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like the angels in heaven. But now, as to whether the dead will be raised, haven't you ever read about this in the writings of Moses, in the story of the burning bush? Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he is the God of the living, not the dead. You have made a serious error. I love Jesus' way of answering people. because he doesn't always answer the question that they want answered. He understands the deeper question that they intend or seem to be asking, rather. So we're going to talk about answers with Jesus. That's what we're going to look at this morning. And of course, we're going to talk about taxes first. Is Jesus really concerned with taxes? You know, this passage has been a puzzling one to a lot of people, I think. I mean, quite simply, doesn't everything belong to God? And doesn't Jesus know that? And if not, why doesn't he know that everything belongs to God? He is God. Why would he have to talk about this, right? How could Jesus support such a cruel empire like the Romans and say, give the gold back to Rome? What a terrible idea from Jesus, isn't it? To support such a terrible empire. Isn't it the role of the Messiah to sweep away empires like this and say, I'm establishing my rule on earth so that you can no longer do this to people? Lots and lots of questions like this, I think, make this passage in particular difficult sometimes. But when we take into account the fact that Jesus is Jewish, then this complicates things all the more. You see, the Jews were waiting around for hundreds of years, thousands of years, really, to get the world sorted out the way that God told them all along that it would be. You see, the prophets had prophesied for years upon years, spanning hundreds of years, telling the people, God has got this. You need only wait. God will work this out. There was a brief moment of time before Jesus, from about 160 to about 60 BC, under the Hasmoneans. Some of you may recognize that name, some may not. The big important thing about them is that they kind of carved out for about 100 years their own little rebel kingdom. Obviously, it didn't last too long. The Romans came in and swept them out easily. But for a while there, the Jews thought they were back. They thought they had it figured out again. Then Rome quit playing around and finally did what they had been wanting to do for a while, and they destroyed them. They destroyed Jerusalem in the process, and they put Israel under their thumb. And all of this leads to the moment that we see playing out right now between these religious leaders and Jesus. And so this moment bears greater significance when you understand the history of the Jewish people. Sometimes we forget to do that. We forget to look at and understand what had happened before and how that might affect what Jesus says. If you think back to the earliest commands that we see of God, think back to Exodus 20 with me, to the 10 Commandments. What does God tell them there? Not to make anything, commandment number 3, with a carved image upon it. Because God cannot be contained within an image like that. God does not look like the carved images that we might create. Well, what does this have to do with the Roman coin? Well, at the time of Jesus, the Jews in particular, a lot of them, most of them in fact, refused to use Roman coins. Here's why. On one side of the coin was the carved image of Tiberius Caesar at the time of Jesus. The Caesar of Rome, right? He's in charge. He gets to put his mark on the coinage that gets used in his kingdom. Notice, his kingdom. Around the outside of the carved image read these words, obviously in Latin, not in English. Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine, or son of God of Augustus. Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, and so all the emperors that came after him were sons of Augustus, who was believed to have been divine, like a god. So literally, upon the coin that Jesus asked them to produce are read the words, Son of God, Son of the divine. How do you think that struck Jesus, knowing that He Himself is the only true Son of God? On the other side of the coin were the words, High Priest. So not only, now, High Priest obviously of the Roman cult, not of the Jewish life, But not only did it read Son of God, it also read High Priest. What are the roles that Jesus himself took up for us and for his people? That of Son of God and of High Priest. So how is Jesus going to do with a coin like this, right? That's where the trap lies. Because on this coin is the idea that Caesar is both the Son of God and High Priest. And the irony for us as the readers of Mark's Gospel couldn't be more stark. Because what have we been reading all along? Jesus is the Son of God. From Mark chapter 1, we read that Jesus is the Son of God. And so some Jews in Jesus' day, again, most of them, went out of their way not to even touch, some not to even look upon these coins because they were so blasphemous to the idea of that third commandment, right? That you cannot create a carved image of God. So instead, they tried to use the local temple coins. So Jesus is asking the religious leaders even to produce the coin would have put them in a bit of a pickle. Because if they've got coins, if they themselves are using these coins, that could set them at odds with the people. You see the way Jesus subtly subverts their own power right in the midst of other people that are around him. Because they have to now produce that coin and show them, oh, okay, yeah, we do use Rome's coins. I love the way Jesus works. And they believe the trap that they're laying is very clever, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have come to him with it. They either want Jesus to support paying taxes to Rome, which would obviously drive the crowds away from Jesus, right? That would solve their problem right there. These huge crowds are following Jesus. He's gaining momentum. He continues to gain followers. If he supports Rome by paying taxes, boom, we've taken care of that problem, right? You can see how wise they must be by coming up with this. Or perhaps if he says, no, don't pay your taxes, now he's subverting the authority of Rome. Now we can bring him up on charges of sedition. Now Rome, Pontius Pilate, will take care of this guy for us. We know it, because if he's not going to pay taxes, Rome will get involved at that point. Oh, they're very clever, aren't they? So what of Jesus' response? What do we think of that? Well, it's interesting that Jesus neither directly agrees with paying taxes, nor is he charged with sedition. He merely claims that so long as those coins bear Caesar's image, send them back. What's the harm in that? If it has Caesar's image on it, sure, you can give it back to him. It already has his image, why not? Just send it back to him. The second, the point of Jesus' statement, I think, isn't really about taxes at all. Because Jesus is saying coins mean nothing, ultimately. Right? Coins you can just give back. But what belongs to God? That's the ultimate question here. What belongs to God? So what does belong to God? I believe the way that Jesus answers or responds in this moment tells us precisely what he means by this. If you want to, you can turn back to Genesis chapter 1. Verses 26 and 27 read this way. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. You notice in Mark chapter 12 the language that Jesus uses about the coin. He says, whose image is stamped upon? The New Testament's written in Greek. There's a version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint written in Greek. In Genesis chapter 1, I went and looked it up. What's the word being used in Genesis chapter 1? The same word that Jesus uses in Mark chapter 12 of the image upon the coin. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give back the coinage to Caesar. That doesn't matter. Give to God what is God's. What belongs to God? What is stamped with God's image? Every person, every life, every soul, whatever the language you want to use there, I am stamped with God's image. I don't think they were caught off guard by what he was saying. I don't think they were confused by what he was saying. I think immediately they would have recognized that language and gone, uh-oh. We came here to trap him and he trapped us instead. We are stamped with God's image. So what is this but an indictment, right? Jesus is indicting them by saying, you think you're doing what you're supposed to, but you have not given to God what is His, meaning your life. And his statement here, I don't think, is about church and state, although this passage sometimes gets brought up that way in our modern context, that we want to talk about the separation of church and state, things like that. That's a modern problem. That's a contemporary problem that requires Christians, I think, to thoughtfully think through, modern answers to it. Jesus here is making a theological statement. He's making a human statement as well. That you are stamped. Every person is stamped with the image of God. And so give back to God what belongs to Him. Give your life to God. Make sure that you remember who your Creator is. And then we have this moment of discussion about resurrection with the Sadducees. A lot of thoughts about what happens to people when they die, right? You know that. I mean, how many books, I was going to say go to a bookstore, but nobody really goes to bookstores anymore. But let's suppose we did for a moment. There's a Barnes & Noble still in our city, isn't there? Yeah. Suppose we all went to Barnes & Noble. Not today, obviously, because you're not supposed to get out in public. And that's fine. But let's just, in our mind, let's imagine we went to Barnes & Noble. And we wanted to find out, what is heaven like? What's the afterlife like? Well, we could find a section on that. How many books would be there? Probably dozens. I don't know how big Barnes & Noble is. Maybe hundreds? It just depends, right? Go to the library. Look up that same topic. How many people have written on this subject? How many things are out there about the afterlife, about resurrection? So many books. How much do we really know about it? The truth is, very little. Not enough to write a book about, I'll tell you that much. At least not for me. But those thoughts that get written down, they often get expressed when people die. And we hear them especially when famous people die. Now, how many of you were aware that, Kobe Bryant, famous basketball player, died recently, right? Probably most of you, if you keep up with the news at all. Very famous basketball player. If you listen to some of the things that people say about famous people when they die, because those funerals or those memorials tend to get televised or written about a lot, spoken about a lot. People say all kinds of things about death and about resurrection. God needed that person in heaven now. That's why God took him away. He's become some angel child floating up in heaven with the stars. All kinds of things get said at deaths. The Sadducees that Jesus is interacting with in this moment didn't believe at all in resurrection. Not a bit. So when they come to Jesus with this question, He knows immediately that they're playing a game, right? He's just going from one game to the next with these religious leaders. How frustrated do you think Jesus must have gotten over his 2 to 3 years of ministry of seeing all these supposedly learned men coming to him with these questions, They did so under false pretenses. How frustrated must he have been? I know I would have been frustrated if I were him. The Sadducees, what's interesting about them is a lot of people believe them to have been the liberals of their time, right? They don't believe in resurrection. Those liberals. Actually, if you want to use liberal and conservative, those words, they were the more conservative of the Jewish believers at the time. Here's why. They believed that only the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, ought to be held as authoritative for the Jews. Whereas the Pharisees and other Jewish groups at the time believed that all of what we call the current Old Testament was authoritative for their lives. So that would include the prophets and the writings as well. The Sadducees did not believe that. So they were actually more conservative in that way, holding to the 5 books of Moses as truly authoritative and inspired by God. And so because of that, they believed resurrection to be a dangerous idea because they don't see it in the books of Moses. And, okay, go back and read the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. You don't really see it there. And so for them, it was this dangerous idea that had been concocted over time in their faith, and people had latched onto it because they wanted to, not because it was worth believing and not because it was true. And they didn't trust the interpretation by the Pharisees because the Pharisees used books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and others that do sort of talk about resurrection. So the question the Sadducees posed to Jesus is a way for them to test not only his knowledge, not just that, but it's his allegiance also. Are you going to be true to God's Word, or are you going to go along with these other groups that aren't true to God's Word? We don't ever have conversations like that, do we? That doesn't sound like us at all. You'll notice by the question they pose that they draw on the law of Moses itself. In Deuteronomy 25, you can read about the law that if a man dies, his brother is supposed to have a child with his sister-in-law, ex-sister, I don't know what you call him after that point, but whatever, his widowed sister-in-law. He's supposed to take on that job so that she can have a child, and that child would bear the name of the brother who passed. I mean, that law is in the books of Moses. Jesus knows that. He knows that they are quoting law to him. So the Sadducees reckon that the resurrection must be ridiculous. Because how could she be married to all 7 of these brothers in the resurrection? Jesus responds to their question in 2 ways. The first way he responds is that in the life to come, in the age to come, that it will be similar but different to the one that we experience now. Marriage will not be a thing in heaven. It's not going to be a thing in the age to come, which kind of bothers us sometimes. Right? It kind of bothers us sometimes, but here we have Jesus talking directly about that. Sometimes we take his statement to mean, yeah, we're just going to be like the angels. We're going to get little wings, even though angels are never described as having little wings, but we feel like we're going to get little wings and fly around everywhere, and we're going to be some beams of light and things like that, which is all, of course, pure ridiculous nonsense, because we don't see that in Scripture. Instead, Jesus says, in this respect, or in this way, they will be like, you all will be like the angels in the resurrection. Meaning, angels must not ever get married. Which, that's kind of sad for them. But anyway, that's beside the point. The second way he responds, though, notice the passage Jesus chooses to quote to them in this moment. What does he quote from? He quotes from the books of Moses. Well, why does he do that? Well, because that's the only text that they're going to agree is authoritative for them. Right? If he had drawn from Jeremiah, or if he had gone to Daniel and said, if you guys would just read Daniel, you'd get it. You'd understand. Or if you guys would just read Job or whatever, you'd understand about resurrection. But of course, that's not going to work for them any more than talking to an atheist is going to, if you just read the Bible, you'd get it. Well, okay, maybe they don't want to. So maybe we got to talk to them about different things, different ways about understanding God and coming to a relationship with God, and then introduce them later on. Jesus is doing the right thing here. He's pointing directly to their text that they would read and know and understand. And so he points to the books of Moses. He points to this moment when God introduces himself to Moses and said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What does this mean? Does this mean that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are already in heaven, that they're already, resurrected in some way? It's a difficult question to answer because the truth is we don't fully know. And I don't think in Scripture we're ever given a definitive answer one way or the other. Some people may disagree with that, and that's okay. I think in some way what it means is that whether they're earthly life has ended now, and it's only, in the resurrection that they'll be alive again. What God is saying is that He's not done with them, right? That death wasn't the end of who they are. Which, of course, is not just a common idea now. That was a common idea back in their time as well, that death was it. After death is just blackness and there's nothing else. There is no more existence. God's response here, what Jesus is saying, is that by God saying, I am the God of Jacob, not I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, means that in some sense, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will live on. That there is a resurrection to come. We talked about hope a lot this morning in our communion talk, and whenever we started, Jim's led a lot of songs about assurance and hope. There's nothing that gives me more hope in life than the resurrection. Nothing. And it can be difficult to remember resurrection when we go through difficult times. Because there's a lot that pulls us down. Not just taxes, although taxes are part of that. But when we have situations like what we're dealing with right now with this coronavirus, when we have moments of great turmoil in our life because we lose a loved one, or on and on and on we can think of situations, resurrection gives me hope. Resurrection propels me forward to continue in the life that I want to live, because I know that death is not the end for me. The question then is, how do I get other people to see that same hope? How do I get other people to understand, to recognize that hope is worth anything that I might suffer in this life? So as we end today, I want to think about a couple of questions. The first is, do we live our lives honoring the image of God stamped upon us? You have been marked with the image of God, whether you want to be or not. You didn't get a choice in it. You didn't get a say in the matter. God didn't ask you when you were born, hey, do you want this? He just did it to you. The same as that gold, those gold coins with the Caesar, didn't get asked whether they wanted to be stamped in that way. They just were. You have been stamped with the image of God. What are you doing with it? Do you live your life honoring that image or not? And then the second thing is, stop working. Will you push the next one? Thank you. I don't know why. Randomly. Oh. The second thing is, are you excited about the age to come, and does it fill you with hope? And then if it does fill you with hope, how do you express that hope to other people? Do they get a sense of that, the hope that fills you with joy? Do they see that in your life? There's good news that we have to offer people. But the truth is, before we can do that, we ourselves have to be filled with that good news. We ourselves have to get a sense of what that means so that we can share it with other people. I hope, I pray that you do. And that this week you are able to offer in a very difficult time for people the hope that can only come through the resurrection of Jesus. There's only one place that people are going to find the hope that they're looking for. And it's in God. It's through His Son because of what He did for them. So as we leave today, remember to carry that good news with you. Remember to carry that hope with you. And remind people, as Jesus did with the Pharisees and those Herodians, you have the image of God stamped upon you. Go do something with it. It's family time right now. And I want to remind you as we end our worship to hang around. Let's talk about what the next few weeks may look like up here with regard to our worship services, because we want to hear from you. We want you to feel like you're giving input and having this conversation. So please don't run off. Hang around. Let's talk for a few minutes so we can do that. One of the things I want to remind you of during our family time right now is, notice we've got a lot of people gone. We do have a lot of people concerned, not just for themselves, but for those that may live with them or for those that they may come in contact with throughout the week. One of the ways to look at the idea of somebody not coming to worship this morning is not out of fear, but out of care for their neighbor. I think if we reframe it in that way, that makes a lot of sense. It's care for neighbor to stay home this morning for some people, that they know that they're going to be in interactions this week with people who may be susceptible to catching this virus. That's not fear. That's taking care of your neighbor. So let's respond to those who didn't come this morning in love and respect, and offer them, if they need something from us, what can we do for them? And one of the things that I wanted to let you know about, and that we'll be sending an email out about today or tomorrow here very, very quickly, is if you feel like you need to be quarantined, if you feel like you need to do self-quarantine because you're worried that you may have contracted the virus or the flu or anything, please let me know. Please let one of the elders know. We're going to find somebody to bring you groceries. Okay? You don't need to be getting out if you feel like you might get sick or might get other people sick. So please understand that we as a church want to take care of you. That's what family is about, okay? And know that you will be taken care of. As we end with our family time, whatever needs you may have to bring before us, please do so as we stand and sing.